Welcome to the lazyfluency podcast, where we have casual conversations switching between English and Japanese so that you can learn from and with us along the way. I'm Joey.
And I'm Miami.
And the topic of the day is parasocial relationships. But before we get into that, make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and or drop a review on whatever platform you're listening on. We appreciate the support. And with that out of the way, parasocial relationships. We talked about this topic a little bit before in an episode about VTubers, I believe, but there's one reason we're deciding to do the topic today, and that is because, drumroll please, drumroll, I'm finally going to Japan. Yay!
Yay!
Big yay, actually. Yeah. So for those who've missed that one episode, I mentioned it before, but this podcast started during the thing I cannot talk about because of Spotify's rules and regulations. And I mean, I can talk about it, but whatever, separate conversation. And because of that, I've never actually been able, either way, we've never actually met in person, I, me, and myself. Therefore, we thought, because we'll finally, like, next episode forward, at least for the time being, maybe we'll see, we'll be doing in person, as in we'll both be in the same location. And because of that, we decided parasocial relationships is very relevant to, I don't know, maybe the relationship that we're having in terms of this podcast, maybe the relationship we're having with the audience. So for those who haven't listened, I think, to the previous episode, we talked about this. A parasocial relationship is, you can read the Japanese definition. I'll go off the top of my head understanding of it. So how I understand it, it's a like unilateral relationship between somebody that takes place over the internet, as in one person is giving way more in terms of like from their perception of the relationship versus another person. It's commonly used in terms of like influencers. So where they, or like YouTubers, Twitch streamers, where they are talking a lot, they're conversing a lot, they're giving a lot of information about themselves. And the other person is listening to it the whole time and feeling like they're getting a relationship, but the YouTuber themselves doesn't really know that much about the person they're speaking to. Do you want to give the Japanese definition?
そう、日本語でサーチするとね、パラソーシャル相互作用っていうのは、1956年に、社会学者の人が造語で作ったやつね。で、心理的な人間関係の一種で、パラソーシャル関係は対面の人間関係なんだけど、片方は実際には全く関係の中にはいない。ちょっとわかんないな。でもさっき言ってた英語で言ってたように、そのスターとか俳優、モデル、クリエイターとかね、インフルエンサーと、一般に聞いてる人との関係を表してるんだって。で、そこに、自分は例えばインフルエンサーと親密であるっていう勘違いっていうか、幻想が生まれちゃうっていうのが、このパラソーシャル相互作用で起こるんだって。
Yeah. This is a simple question. What is a relationship? How would you define just any a relationship? What does it mean? And I don't mean like romantic. I mean, or romantic is included. But what does it fundamentally mean to have a relationship? Because I feel like we're going to be discussing about how I feel like there's kind of a blurry line here. But off the top of your head, if you had to define a relationship, how would you define it?
すごい哲学的な話題だな。relationship はね、なんだろう。相手を、知って、それでその間に、信頼関係とかね、が築ける関係だと思うんだよ。だから。
What about, for example, I mean, okay, I'll go through some examples. There's like familiar relationships, like I don't trust, I'm not going to go into my cousins. I'm not very close with my cousins. I don't necessarily trust my cousins. I don't distrust my cousins, but we are cousins, and therefore that is technically a relationship. Maybe that falls into a different category. Does that make sense? But there's people who aren't related to me at all, who I'd say I'm very close with, obviously like friends and other stuff, who I'm trust more than family or whatever situations like that. Yeah. So in that sense, I mean, maybe I should separate them to two categories. If we ignore familial, like blood relationships and just talk about what it means socially speaking, it might be a little more productive. But yeah, I mean, the reason I'm kind of being nitpicky about this definition is I feel like nowadays the line between parasocial relationship and relationship seem a little arbitrary to me. There is definitely a thing where I think if somebody's all their interactions are happening online, which is becoming more and more common, it probably doesn't have a lot of good health effects for the person. But in a lot of cases, I feel like there is a degree of, like, obviously you can talk about whether you'd have a closer relationship if it was in person. But there are a lot of relationships that I have a closer relationship that I've only formed online than I formed ever by meeting somebody in person. Like, think of somebody in your school, or maybe like a shiriai or acquaintance.
まあ、そうだね。まあ、いいところは、そのインターネット上だとさ、周りにいる人ってさ、なんて言うんだろう、限られた環境の中でさ、その人間関係を作っていかないといけないからさ、自分に合わないとかね、価値観が合わないとか、話が合わない人と一緒に過ごさないといけなくて、その中で薄っぺらい表面上の関係を作らないといけないじゃん。実際の今いるこのね、狭い世界だと。でも、オンラインだとそのね、自分の考えと合ったりとかね、価値観が合う人と話せて、そこに信頼関係が作れるっていう点では、オンラインの方が強い relationship っていうのは生まれる可能性もあると。
Yeah. I mean, I keep avoiding the topic of hikikomori just because I want to do the topic properly. But I will say that this does tie into that a lot, in the sense that for hikikomori, a lot of times they have trouble even communicating with their direct family. And even though it's kind of a double-edged sword, one of the reasons that's posed as to why hikikomori became a thing is because it's now easier than ever to with like the emergence of the internet, to maintain some aspects of a social life through the internet, where before, if you did not have a good relationship with your family or anybody else, you were in like desolate loneliness. So I feel like in that, if we're talking about obviously having positives, I do think it has positives. But for example, this is the other thing I'm kind of curious about. Let's think of we're going to give an early shout out to some of our BIP commenters here, like Shockox or Oddity, which we have frequent commenters here who always drop banger comments. At what point of responding and giving comments is there a relationship there? Do you know what I'm talking about? Between the creators of us as the podcast and the listeners. Or for example, like, if there's somebody that you, this is actually a funny example. On YouTube, a lot of people who watch YouTube might know who I'm talking about. But there's a person called Just Some Guy with a Mustache, sorry. And he's like known, he has like, I think like 400,000 subscribers, and he's never uploaded a single video. And all he does is comment on videos all across YouTube. But he's comments so frequently that he's actually like known online, and he actually goes into pretty small communities. Like, he's subscribed to some people that are pretty niche in terms of subscriber count, and he gets in a very long I think I've had conversations with him back and forth. And that's kind of a one-on-one thing, but in that sense, we're both anonymous. So obviously it seems like the definition for parasocial relationships seems to be hinging on people with a larger, I don't know if a larger platform has to do with it, or maybe they're not directly in a one-on-one conversation, but even like in a Twitch chat, for example, a lot of famous Twitch streamers, they'll address somebody in their Twitch chat, and they'll go, this person says blank. How many times do they have to say that, or like address somebody and respond to them for there to be a relationship? And is there not information being shared? To me, it seems like the core part of a parasocial relationship is just the imbalance of information that is being shared. But then what are your thoughts on that?
質問はあれだよね。どれぐらいのこの受け渡し、キャッチボールみたいな会話でそのリレーションシップが築かれたって言えるかでしょ?
Yeah.
一回でもさ、その人間関係は築けるとは思うんだよ。で、上位の考えはあれだよね。その、どれだけ共有されてるかでしょ、その情報が。
Yeah.
私もそう思うな。例えばさ、 普通の人間関係だってさ、渡すのともらうのがさ、ちょっとアンバランスだと、やっぱりね、
Yeah.
あんまうまくいかない人間関係だから、まあそれが、パラソーシャルのね、人間関係にも、まあ、当てはまるとは思う。ね。まあ、
Yeah. Well,
一
I think
つ、
one
うん。
example that, oh, go
うん。
ahead. Sorry.
ちょっと話題は変わっちゃうかもしれないんだけど、やっぱりネット上だとさ、なんて言うんだろう。あんまりジェニュインに話さない人もいるじゃん。ね、怖
Yeah.
い、そうそうだ、なんていうの、本当の意見言わないとか、そういうのって、実際の、リアルライフの、関係だとさ、まあ、その仕草とか、まあ、顔の表情とかで、あ、この人はちょっと正直じゃないな、嘘ついてるなっていうのはわかるけど、でも、パラソーシャルだと、まあ、相手の顔とかね、その様子とかが見えないから、その信憑性がちょっとわからないよね。そこは危ないとは思う。うん。
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, I kind of actually think the opposite, where people are, when they're online, they're more anonymous and therefore they're more separated from the consequences of their actions. And that allows them to be
あ
more truthful, which in most cases, that allows them to be more, I don't know, racist,
あ、うん、そうだね。確かに。それもそう。
defamatory, and
う
other
ん。
things like that.
う
Um,
ん。
but there's okay, the example I was going to talk about, which is, this is, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I think people take for granted with relationships, like as I mentioned before, familiar bonds and things like that. But I know so many people. So my dad, for example, he said, I was talking to my dad, and he said that he probably exchanged less than 200 words with his dad his entire life.
うん。
Less than 200 words his entire life with his dad. And it's like, is that a close relationship? My dad, I think, definitely has a lot of respect for my dad. I refer to him as my dad's dad because I never knew my
う
grandfather
ん。
on that
う
side.
ん。
So I've never seen him. I never knew anything about him. Well, I mean, I've heard about him, but, or for example, it's very common. Oh, are you there?
うんうん。ね、200語って人生で200語しか話さないってどういうこと？
Yeah, no, that's what he said. Like
だ、
they never exchanged more than, like, yeah, that's what he said.
だっておはようっていう、一日おはようって一言言うだけで
No,
さ、
no, no, no. I don't think they had that. I mean, he was like, my dad's very old. He's 75 given my
うんうんう
age.
ん。
So that for my age, that's very old dad. And
う
so I
ん。
think like with his era, it was extremely common to, like, his dad, I mean, not to get too much into it, but he like worked and worked and worked and worked, and that's kind of the
あ、
only
忙
relationship
しいっ
he
てこ
had
と？
with any of the
うん。
yeah, with any of the children. Because my dad was
な
like
る
a
ほど。
child of one of like 9.
う
So
あ、
yeah,
そうか、それ分配されちゃうのよね、一人一人に。多い分。
yeah.
うん。
But the other example I was going to give is a lot of East Asian families that I know have, from what in my opinion, a terrible relationship with their sons. I have a really good friend who's Korean, and he is like frightened to talk to his mom or his dad. And the only time he makes any sort of conversation, he basically like bundles up into a ball, starts looking at the floor, and then whispers in Korean anytime he has a conversation. And then his parents, I don't want to pretend to do a Korean accent, but he's a very deep. And I was like, and I was his roommate for multiple years in college, and so I feel it's funny. Some people take for granted to be like, oh yeah, no, your closest relationships, the healthiest relationships, or whatever. Maybe they should be your familiar relationships, but I feel like a lot of the time it's not the case, and I feel it's weird. So for something in YouTube, I saw a video talking about how parasocial relationships are unhealthy, parasocial relationships are bad, real relationships are better. But the thing is, nowadays, more and more relationships are parasocial, and in lot, like I said, in the case of hikikomori, without the parasocial relationship, you're looking at much worse consequences than with the parasocial. Than with the parasocial relationship. And so I feel it's a little weird. And also, my other opinion is there are bits of, it's still called a parasocial relationship. There is a relationship there. And the other person, I believe, obviously it's a degree, but like I said, with the commenters, I'm not saying it's like a big relationship we have with the people that we respond to, but we are being genuine. And obviously, when you're speaking or in a podcast, you try to maintain a certain cadence or whatever, and some other stuff. But I feel like in all aspects of life, people are acting and adapting to their environment they're talking in, and so I do feel like being genuine, or even people who aren't being genuine. Like they're acting on their YouTube channel, whatever, you are getting to know a side of them, and that side of them is still part of them. You know what I'm saying?
まあ
I'm
まあ
basically, in short, I'm kind of trying to say like that I feel like people discredit the amount that somebody's actually learning about somebody else. I've heard streamers say something like, you don't know anything about me. You don't know anything about me. But it's like some people stream for 10 hours a day, 10 hours a day, every day. And they have people who watch them for 10 hours a day, every day. Those people know a lot about you. Like, just because you say it doesn't mean it's not true. You can't hide your mannerisms, personalities, your ways of thinking, your framework, like about information for 10 hours a day. It's just impossible. That's just not true. They know a lot about you. And so, like, especially like I said, if my dad can have a fatherly relationship with under 200 words, you can definitely know somebody if you listen to them for thousands of hours. Yeah.
じゃあさ、質問だけど、リアルライフで、得られないもので、パラソーシャルで、得られる、そのものって何だと思う？
I mean, there's obviously physical stuff you can't, like if it's a romantic relationship, or
まあ
like
ね。
even if it's not a romantic relationship, you can't hug them. I think you probably just can't activate specific pheromones. Literally, probably that's it. Like if you're going
あ、
medical,
オッ
like
ケーオッケー。
they're probably like dopamine related to hugging or something, or dopamine related to um, handshakes or small things like that that are hard to replicate.
まあ、私どっち聞いたか忘れたけど、さっき確か聞いたのが、リアルライフで得られないで、パラソーシャルで得られるものだから逆じゃない？それ。
Oh, okay.
じゃあ、
if the
逆は？
the reverse is easy. Obviously, I mean, this podcast is a great example. I've yet to meet a single Japanese person in Idaho. Just straight up. Just has not happened. So this podcast would not exist. So what I would say is one benefit of a parasocial relationship is it allows you to, and you mentioned this at the beginning, to access people who are not in your general place that you live, or people who are more rare across an average population. But it doesn't matter, because since you have the internet, despite how infrequent a certain type of person is, you can still find them. For example, like for this podcast to work, you need people who must speak English and Japanese, and obviously have the time to do so. And one of them has to have like video editing skills and all this stuff. And having those all together in one package that also are personal enough to have a conversation and know how to schedule stuff like that. There aren't that many people who fall into that category. But the internet allows you to find people like that. So.
ね、確かに。そう考えると、あれだね。まあ、よく、今の世代の若者はネットばっかで、実際の人間関係を、なんていうの、重要視してないとか言うけど、まあでも、なんて言うんだろう。ネットによってさ、この、ね、身の回りの世界に満足できてない人たちは、そこに、まあ、ネットに足を踏み入れることで、もっとなんか、メンタル的に、まあ、健康になるっていうのは、まあ、否めないよね。
Yeah. I've thought of something that I'm kind of not happy that I think this is the way things might go towards, but we talked about virtual reality before in a previous episode, and how I think if virtual reality gets good enough, I think it's going to be very common for a lot of stuff that we do in the real world society to get transferred online, basically. And I can totally see there being a situation where people like me, so quick thing about psychology. I have some friends majored in psychology. I'm not I'm not a psychologist, but from what I understand about psychology, what makes the disorder is almost entirely, except for some things that are like literally is there are some genes in your, or not like identifiable genes or sequences that they like autism, I think, or sorry, Down syndrome, which is like a purely like medical brain thing. A lot of what is considered to be a disorder is very relative to the society that you are in. And I don't mean like the human society. I mean like the society, Japanese society, Korean society, American society, things like that. And so, and a lot of disorders that have to do with like failure to adjust are literally called adjustment disorders. Like one example my friend gave me was a Hispanic person moves into a new neighborhood or a new school, and they have difficulty acclimating to that environment, and they have difficulty making friends. And if I'm remembering this correctly, my friend said, yeah, you could classify somebody like that with an adjustment disorder, which is weird because if they were yeah, which is weird because if they were, let's say if they're from Mexican, if they were in Mexico, they probably wouldn't be having that disorder. So is it something that is intrinsic to the person, or is it society's fault? And so to continue off of that, I mean, Hikimori's in that same space, which I find it. Oh yeah, for my senior thesis for Hikimori, I had to do a lot of reading psychology as well. But what I'm trying to make a point is if the majority of society ends up transferring to being online, the people who will have disorders are those people who are not used to, who prefer being in person. You'll be like, it's really inconvenient that you can't join into the VR world. Like, I think you have reality disorder. Like you should, you know what I'm saying? You're too attached to the real world. I'm kind of joking, but not really, because if the majority of stuff happens online, or for example, even right now, if you're somebody who, let's say for one reason or another, you just can't engage with social media. You can't do it. Like you just, every time you do it, you have a very repulsive response with Twitter. You can't figure it out. You're very bad at handling let's say, I'm not sure, it depends on your job, obviously, but in many situations that can actively impact you from dating. It can prevent you from dating nowadays if you're bad at like showing yourself online. I mean, you could probably argue that incels, which is a whole thing. Have you heard about incels? Have we talked about incels?
Incels って何?
It's somebody who's involuntarily celibate. To be celibate means to not have sex. So incel means somebody who wants to have sex but cannot have sex. It's a whole thing. It's a whole can of worms. Okay. But it's like a whole movement online. But not too important for right now. But my main point is I feel like you could attribute a lot of not being able to present yourself well in an online space or like on a dating app or something like that as a disorder. You know what I'm saying? If people go their entire lives not being able to get a single date or go on create a single relationship, and they really want to their entire lives, and it's because they just can't figure out how to sell themselves on an online platform, is that not a disorder at that point? I feel like eventually that might be considered a disorder.
なんかディソーダーもなんかなんて言うんだろうね。難しいよね。だってなんて言うんだろう。ディソーダーもさっき言ってくれたようにさ、環境によってさ、やっぱ定義も違うしさ、ね、日本でさ、ちょっとあんまり表現ができない人がさ、アメリカ行ったらもうめちゃめちゃ活躍してるとかもあるからね。
Yeah.
ちょっと定義するのがまあ難しいのは事実。
Yeah. I wonder if, for example, I think in America, what is the trait? Assertiveness extroversion. Extroversion is correlated with success in the business place. I wonder if that is the opposite in Japan or something like that. Like being like medatsu. There's a whole notion of sticking out, standing out, and that being a bad thing. I would be very curious to know if personality traits that trend with positive, like success, trend with negative success in Japan.
それはね、程度によるんじゃない？やっぱり全ては程度によると思うんだよ。例えばさ、積極的すぎるは、まあ、積極的すぎるとさ、ちょっと自己中、他の人のことを考えられないっていう言い回しにもできるじゃん。
Well, if you're Japanese, you can do that 言い回し。
まあ言い回しっていうか、まあそうね、その程度が、ちょっと行き過ぎると他の人のことは考えられないっていう、まあそれもなんかの障害であるとは思うんだよ。ね。だから。
I mean, this sounds like a weird comparison, but would you say a tree? Like, here's what I'm saying. So if extroversion, because I'm talking about as a characteristic of somebody. If somebody's very extroverted, I would not say like, for example, if that's just that person, it'd be weird to say that they're just not thinking about others. Like a tree, the reason I'm using a tree analogy, you wouldn't get mad at a tree for not helping you out, you know what I'm saying, if you fell off your bike. And you're saying, oh, this is a weird thing to say. But I'm saying a tree is a tree. Like you're kind of ascribing other influences onto the tree. If a person's extroverted, you're kind of interpreting the extroversion in a weird way. Is kind of how I view it. If you by doing you're extroverted, but I'm going to say that you're not extroverted. And instead, I'm saying you don't think about others as much as you should. I mean, for me, I've been called like, oh my gosh, urusai so many times by Japanese people, like saying I'm like loud or annoying. It's like, bro. It's not that I'm not thinking about you, or whatever, or it's like and there's kind of an assumption there. Me talking. There's an assumption. Why should I assume it's a bad thing? Why should I assume it's meiwaku in the first place? Because that's the assumption. They're like, yeah, you doing this is meiwaku and you should know it's meiwaku. It's like, bro, who are you to decide what is meiwaku? And why am I in the wrong? But yeah.
まあ結局はまあいる環境にね左右されるのはね事実だからね。
Yeah. I mean, even with the other example I wanted to bring up is divorcing, and during the event I can't discuss, which is I believe we talked about this a little bit, but in Japan, where the phenomenon of wives, basically when wives and husbands were able to finally be in the same house because remote work became a thing, there was a trend of couples divorcing because the whole reason the relationship worked is because they never had to interact with each other. This is the same thing I think we talked about men retiring in Japan and then having their relationships fall apart with their wives because like I said, the relationship worked because they never had to interact with each other. But it seems there's like a big part of the perception of how good or healthy a relationship is purely a like show and a perspective. Like I'm saying, a lot of people say, oh, they've been married for 30 years. Wow, that's such a strong relationship. But for a lot of times, like in the case of the video that I was talking about retirement, the women would literally just wait to try to get as much money as possible from the man. Because once they get like, what's called? It's like the more they work, the higher their pay goes, and the longer they stay, the more percentage of their more property they're able to acquire upon a divorce. And it's like, but from the society's and the government's perspective, they're like, wow, that is a success. We just did a success right there. That we made a successful relationship.
まあ、
yeah.
そもそもだってまあコロナでさねなんていうんだテレワークしてずっと家にいてそれが嫌になってディボースするじゃん離婚するじゃん。
Yeah.
そもそもそれなんていうのずっと一緒にいてさ離婚する関係だったら最初から結婚しない方が良くないと思うんだけどね。
Yeah, I mean that gets into whole like what reasons people marry for, and like historically, like there is a historical reason of a lot of countries marrying for upwards social mobility. That's probably like a long conversation, but obviously the more Western perspective is that's not what marriage is about. And I think the more developed countries get, the more it tends to be about like forming lifelong unions of some sort.
そうね、家族を持つことがなんか成功みたいな感じだからね。
Oh, I didn't say that. Well, I guess it depends. Or did I say that? I guess depends on your definition of family.
Okay.
Yeah, of a family is just the couple by themselves. Like yeah, or like. Yeah, but that's a whole separate conversation. Yeah, let us know what you think. Are we creating even more toxic relationships by talking about this? And I mean between us and you listeners. What are your thoughts on parasocial relationships? Yeah.
Hello, we're back.
戻ってまいりました。
Yep. So, in the middle section, we're going to talk about life updates and more. So, I'm going to start. And my...
おめでとう!
Yay. My news is I finally am released from the exam week.
おめでとう!
Yeah,
I'm
just so happy. Like, the exam week was... I don't know, for 1 month?
全国のテストも、その普通の学のテストだけじゃなくて、その全国の医学テストも終わった。
Yeah, exactly. So the last one, the national exam was like there were 6 blocks and it was 6 hour long. So that was so I was imprisoned in the one building for 10 hours. 10 hours. Am I a prisoner?
何個なの
There's
今回は。
6 blocks and there were 320 questions.
この CBT と前のテストも含めてどのぐらいあるのってこと。
Okay. So for school regular exams, I had 7 subjects. Yep. And for CBT, which is a national exam, how do I say? 出題範囲 出題範囲
the range of questions being given out?
Yeah. Was from the first year to 4th year. Yeah, I've learned. So, yeah, the entire 4 years. So, yeah.
まあ、やっとだね。
Yeah. I can't believe I've come this long. Yeah.
でもすごく大事なことは、これからそのテストがほぼないでしょ
？Yeah, compared
卒業する
to
までは。
yeah.
まあ、すごくいいこと。
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, in
ちょっとこ
January.
の来たるホリデーにぴったりだね。この感謝祭。
Oh, yeah, 感謝祭. So, you have Thanksgiving in 5 days? 6 days?
今日はいつでしたっけ？金曜日
18th?
金曜日
Yeah.
で、次の木曜日が関西の、何でしたっけ？感謝祭。Thanksgiving Day。で、実は私は日本に行くのは感謝祭だけど、その切符は結構高かったから、感謝祭に切符を買わないといけなかった。
Yeah.
ちょっと残念だけど、それでその感謝祭の前の日に感謝祭を祝うことにした家族と。
Yeah, but you got lucky because everyone wants to celebrate the Thanksgiving Day, so they won't buy tickets. So that's why you got the cheaper tickets, right?
いや、そう。実はその感謝祭の切符と感謝祭以外の切符は$800の違いがあった。$800。
$800 difference?
そう。
Well, that's a lot. 8万円。Yeah,
で、それが一番低いのやつとの違い。でも平均的な切符の違いは多分$1,500。
Wow. That's a lot.
やばい。
wow.
マジで。
Well, you got lucky.
すごく感謝しています。テストが終わらせたことが感謝してるかもしれないけど、私の感謝の日は感謝祭の一番感謝してることは、こういう切符を買うことができたこと。
Yeah. Or maybe it's because of our audience. Yeah, for supporting us. Yeah.
どういう関係あるの？まあ感謝してるんだ。Yeah.
Because of them, because they listen to our podcast that led to our, this good news.
そう。そうかもしれない。実は言い忘れたことがある。実はエピソードの最初に言いたかったんだけど、新しい YouTube の動画、公開されたので、ぜひチェックしてみてください。
Yeah,
何でしたっけ、
we
トピックは。
released.
How Americans View Japanese YouTube というタイトルあるんだけど、今まで聞いてた人なら多分それ見て喜ぶでしょう。
Yeah. I guess, maybe like some people here don't know our main channel.
そう、YouTube の、他の日本の文化に関する、大体日本の文化と言語に関する動画をアップロードしているので、そのことに興味あったら、ぜひ、チェックしてください。
lazyfluency.
lazyfluency だけ。で、このポッドキャストは lazyfluency ポッドキャスト podcast。
そうそう。
でもまあ、何て言うか、今週の他のニュースに関しては、日本ではみんなマスクをつけてるでしょ今でも。
Yeah, we do.
それ最近私が聞いたニュースは、のび太という YouTube チャンネルだけど、
I
そうい
know,
う
I know him. Yeah.
そう。子供もなんか生まれてからじゃないかもしれないんだけど、まあそういうこともいるかもしれないけど、その幼い人に関しては、そういうマスクをつけるのにすごく慣れてる。
Mm-hmm.
でも、その幼い時にマスクをつけすぎると、そういう他の人の感想とか感情をちゃんと理解できない傾向がある。で、それがなんかうつ病と他のいろんな悪影響を及ぼしてるらしい。
及ぼしてるらしい。
及ぼしてる、そう。で、そのマスクをつけないと恥ずかしすぎるので、ちょっとそのカウパンツの前の流行語の話に戻るんだけど、そのせいでマスクをつけなくてもいいの時でもマスクをつけなくちゃいけない気がする。ほとんどの人は。小学校でも中学校でも高校でも大学までわからないんだけど、そういう政府は実はなんていうかそういう制限がない。それでまあそういうのび太さんの意見はこれからも日本はこういう状況に残るでしょう。まあ多分、このマスクの時代から逃げられない。で、そのせいでこの子供はどういうふうに育っていくのかなと。
But I guess, yeah, that's true. And I had like friends who got so used to wearing masks, and I guess they had this dysmorphia, like
dysmorphia, そう。
Yeah. So they don't since they're
自分のこともわからなくなってしまったってこと。
Yeah, used to like wearing masks, so like they can't accept their faces without wearing masks. So
それと SNS を含めてすごくやばいことだと思うんだけど、そのなんかマスクをつけると、それと SNS を使うとその目が広くなってるとか、
大きくな、
そう大きくなってるとか、その同時に自分の顔のなんか何も分からなくなってしまう可能性があるんじゃない？
That's a deeper discussion. Yeah.
まあ最初のトピックは結構深かったと思うんですが
いや。
まあ最後に言いたいことは、今日初めて DMV に行った Drivers Motor Vehicles と思うけど、その免許を取りに行く場所でもほとんどの人は、まあアメリカの番組とかでDMV は最低の場所、なんか誰も行きたくない、すごく時間かかるし、みんなは性格悪い人ばっかというなんていうかその考えがあるんだけど、私の場合だと全然大丈夫だった。みんな優しくてそんなに時間かかりませんでした。それを言いたかっただけです。
Okay.
DMV を怖がらないでください。そんなに悪くないので。And we're back with the final section.
はい、戻
And
り
if
ました。
you've made it to the final section, drop an email or send an email to lazyfluency@gmail.com. Also, leave an Apple Podcast review. Please. Oh, for Japanese, actually. Ayami, please. Our Japanese people.
日本人のリスナーの皆さん、多分いらっしゃると思うのですが、ね、E メールだったりね、Apple Podcast のレビューとかね、ぜひぜひ、どしどし何でもいいので、送っていただけると、嬉しくて泣きそうです。
I'm already crying. I'm already crying thinking about it. But yeah, this week's episode, we have two awesome comments, but we've shortened them down. It won't seem like that because they're both long, but we've shortened them both down and kind of separated them into two different categories. So the first one I'm calling, what is soft power, and doesn't China have a lot of soft power? So there are two comments here. We'll respond to each one individually. The first one is from Oddity. The fact that probably above 90% of all the stuff your average person uses on a daily basis is made in China is a hell of a soft power, no? I, for one, would be devastated if Israel went to war with China. I could no longer buy ridiculous shit like this from AliExpress at 3 a.m. Lol. Culture-wise, I thought of Wong Kar-wai, Ang Lee, John Woo, and Bruce Lee. Okay, so I'm a cinephile, but I feel like these are deaf pop culture, especially Woo and Bruce Lee. Although it's all Hong Kong cinema, so I'll let you be the judge whether it counts as Chinese. I'm also fond of OnePlus, and Huawei is pretty big around the world. There's also Chinese food, Chinese medicine, Zen, Tao, Confucianism, and martial arts stuff, all of which are very liked. The second comment is from Shockox. I do have some appreciation for the Chinese Jackie Chan movies. He did quite a few between the 70s and 90s, and one of the people popular enough over there to end up in the US. I think China had a soft cultural impact for a bit with Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. The thing with that, though, is that I don't know anyone else. I'm amazed at how people in the US can hate China as much as they do, but love Kung Fu as much as they do. Also, upset we don't have Huawei phones here. I don't care if they spy on me. As a citizen, the spy thing doesn't bother me since American companies already do the same. Then he says, also, Genshin is a good game. I can't confirm or deny this. I have a bias against Genshin. I'll just say that right now. Didn't spend much money on it, though. I think my brother might be over the 10K mark for Genshin, which that's insane. And he's in the army. So I think if we go to war with China, he might end up defecting to keep playing Genshin. Okay. General, do you have thoughts on this IME before I give my thoughts?
まあ確かに、ゴリッチが言ってたようにさ、まあ、大体ね、その洋服だったり、電気製品だったりね、チップスとかね、とか、まあ、すべてにおいてさ、メイドインチャイナってすごい。
Is that true in Japan though?
うん、そうだよ。洋服、だって、ユニクロとか、まあ、ユニクロに限ったことじゃないけど、ね、洋服、ほぼほぼ、チャイナだね。うん。
What about, like, the media? Do you feel like there's a strong, a lot of this was referencing cinema. Do you feel like there's a strong feeling of like people understanding or having any affiliation with cinema, Chinese cinema? Whether it be Americanized cinema or not?
映画に関しては、そんなに、中国の映画はね、ポピュラーじゃないね。なんか映画館でやってるのは大体、まあアメリカだったり、で、まあ日本の映画ぐらいだね。そう。
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, what I'll say is, one thing I want to clarify, and the reason I call this is what is soft power ? Is soft. Okay. Two things to distinguish here. So, first one, soft power is not a measure of GDP or the economic presence. So things like it's a measure of your perception. At the end of the day, the country's perception. Do the people like the country, and what are the affiliations they have for the country? The way that then there's a second component there, which is, so there's understanding whether people like a country or view them favorably, and then there's trying to answer the question why. Soft power tries to answer it without looking at the economy. That's just that is by definition of soft power. So by definition isn't looking at that. So things like appliances and things like that, they might help somebody's life and help them go through something, but they're not necessarily tend to be as associated as strong with the country. And I assume it's because they're replaceable. People don't see refrigerators or like electricity as an intrinsic thing. Think about Russia. Russia supplies so much gas to the world, but people aren't like, wow, I love Russia because they supply me gas. It's more of like, man, it sucks that we're dependent on Russia having to supply us gas.
確かにね。じゃあそれが、
and I will, yeah, go ahead.
まあ、そう、まあ、そのデフィニッションだとソフトパワー、チャイナがソフトパワーあるとは言えないっていうのがジョイの主張でしょ?
Yes, yeah. But I'm saying the other stuff is totally true. Like movies, things like Confucianism, Tao, martial arts stuff, as he mentioned, Kung Fu, people like that. I think that falls into it. But I think as Shakik said, at the end of the day, people still don't like China. Being able to recognize stuff is not alone enough to create good perception. And so there was something that I think I should mention in the first episode, and I'll put it on screen here, and I'll read it here. So there's a Stanford study of the trends in global attitudes toward China from 2022. There's way more of these. I'm just using one example, but this is to show that it's not just my perception that people have favorable, negative views towards China. It is a trend, and it has been trend for a while. And so there's a graph here, which we'll put on screen, that shows from 2005 to 2022 of the global trends and favorable opinions of China. And at the highest, it averages a little above 50%, and then the average just drops like a rock continued straight line, and it's been on decline, almost approaching 20 years now. And I think it was even actually decreasing even further behind then. And there is one very thing that I think is interesting, because Audit, you're from Israel, and so I feel like you might find some of these things interesting. So there is a negative correlation with a few things. One, the more democratic a country is, the less it likes China. The more human development a country has, the less it likes China. And the more educated a population is, the less it likes China, unless that community is very impoverished or has very low education in general. I'll read a little statement here. It says, the impact of individuals' education on their attitudes towards China also varied by the socioeconomic development levels of the countries in which they lived. In the most developed countries, education played a negative role in shaping people's opinions of China. In less developed or developing countries, however, education correlated with a more favorable opinion of China. Researchers conjecture that in developed countries, people with higher levels of education would focus more on differences in values and political ideals between China and their own countries, and thus would likely hold an unfavorable opinion of China. However, in less developed countries, more educated persons will focus on economic benefits that China has brought, and thus will likely hold a more favorable attitude toward China. This is to say that the first one probably falls under what you would call a soft power, which is the ideals, how you envision a country. The second one is literally just talking about economy. And so I don't think it falls under soft power. But that might be why you think you're from Israel. I mean, Israel is actually doing really well, so maybe you're not a liar. I mean, but in terms of like overall GDP, it's not like in the top. Actually, I'm not sure if it's in the top 10 or not. But oh yeah, there's something else I'd want to mention, unless there's something you want to mention, Ayami? Do you have any thoughts about that?
まあそうだね。まあ納得はいくね。だってさ、例えば発展途上国だとチャイナがそのものを作ってくれてるから、まあそれは国にとっていいじゃん。だからチャイナありがとうってことで、まあ good impression ね、好印象がある。
Yeah.
し、で反対にもう先進国はdeveloped country はねもうなんていうの、チャイナのプロダクトがまあなかったら困るけど、別になかったとしても自分の国で作れたりね、その自分の国で回せるから、まあなんていうんだろう、lower なね評価が低いっていうのはまあ納得はいくね。
Yeah, no, I agree. So there's next portion of this, which is I called Japan. And so both of them kind of had an extension to talk about Japan and why maybe it has soft power, which I'll give you some information. Yes, it's not just a feeling that Japan is viewed favorably. It is viewed favorably by so many nations, but we'll get into that. So first one by Oddity. Most of the things Joey mentioned as examples of Japanese soft power, anime, video games, manga, appliances, etc. all developed and became popular in post-war Japan following the American occupation, which had a huge impact on Japan with both soft and hard power. The first modern manga, Astro Boy, was inspired by Disney. The creators of the first anime features were also influenced by Disney. Space Invaders was huge, but the first video game was American. What Americans, Canadians, and Aussies seem to like about Japanese culture is merely the reflection back of their own culture. The things are intrinsically Japanese, the kind that you talk about on the podcast, like tatemae, kohai, senpai, relationships between parents and children, dating, practices, bathroom slippers. I don't see these gaining any soft power. And then a comment from Shockox. Also, as for Japanese soft power, I think it's very telling that there's a San, as in like Super San, gym built and opened in California. I haven't heard about one in Japan. I do think that DBZ has had an effect on fitness culture, and I can feel it. I definitely saw a dude popping out reps in 100 times gravity chamber during my formative years, and that definitely had an effect on how I see working hard and paying off today. That's hilarious. So the first thing I want to talk about before discussing this is I could have looked, this is kind of, we're talking about America a lot, so I'm just using, this was talking about America's views over the last 20 years, and they've been very stable. So the lowest it ever got, it looked like, was in 1994 or something. It dropped to like 46%. But aside from that, it's like 69% all the way to 84 and like 80, it just keeps going, 87%. And it seems like the average looks like it's somewhere around like 75% of people viewing, Japan very or mostly favorably. Anyways, to address the question, for one, do you have any thoughts off the bat, Amy? basically the idea that maybe the reason that people like Japan is because they see themselves in Japan.
ちょっと最後のウリリンの最後のパートがちょっとよく分かんなかったんだけど、things that are
intrinsically Japanese. She's saying things that did not get influenced or created because of some American thing. So older culture.
そういうことね。
Yeah.
ね、あれだね、私たちさ、先輩後輩とかね、トイレのスリッパとか、まあ、両親との関係とか、まあそういうのを喋ったけど、それってジャパニーズのね、独特な文化で、それが好きだから、ジャパンが好きっていうわけではないよね。だけど、なんて言うんだろう、アニメは、まあ日本独特のカルチャーじゃん。それが好きで日本に好印象を持ってるっていうのは事実だから、まあ、オリティにはまあ部分的にまあ、賛成というか同意、
Yeah. So I actually disagree. But so one thing I'll say is this is another interesting fact. Across all key demographic groups, there's a strong favorability towards Japan. So it says 84% of Democrats, 80% of Republicans, 86% of independents rating Japan favorably. Also, the higher education correlates even higher. So high school education, 72% more likely to give even favorably. College education, 87%. College degree, 92%. This is just talk about, it's not just my age group. It's not just young people. It's old people, young people, whatever. This is to say that many people who were born, or my dad, the very, very end of World War II or whatever, also view Japan favorably. Or people who... something I want to point out is I don't think just because they create, like, say, anime for something. Anime, so there's a reason cartoons are not as big as anime. So I'm saying if the argument is, or I know this is discussion, but I'm saying if the argument is, well, Americans like what they see in themselves, Americans would like cartoons more than they like anime, but they don't. They like anime more than they like cartoons. And I feel like the Japanese element of anime is entrenched. It is the foundation. I don't think the foundation is based in American animation. And the same thing I feel like is true with manga. Like the values of, if you just look at the core values of a lot of anime, or the most popular anime like Studio Ghibli, a lot of his stuff is anti-established, anti-capitalist. Nature is like a huge thematic element of all his films about how you shouldn't try to take over nature. You should respect nature and be one with nature. Those are all very conflicting with American core values. He also has there's more criticisms towards like individual aspiration to take over. I mean, we could go into like film by film, but his value system is very Japanese, and it comes out a lot of his films. And I feel like the same thing is true with most anime, with most high schools. They're not American high schools; these are Japanese high schools with Japanese names, and the focus is on Japanese events and people or kawaii culture is a whole thing that's intrinsically very Japanesey, and samurai and stuff like that is very Japanesey. And one of the biggest IPs in the U.S., Star Wars, is inspired from a Japanese. It's like a loop. It's inspired from a Kurosawa film, The Seven Samurai, which is inspired from American filmmakers. So it's kind of hard to see where the influence ends and begins. But I definitely think there is the appreciation is just much further than just seeing what you see in the other person, because Japan is very, very, very different from the US. People don't have any guns in Japan, like that Americans would hate that, and obviously the value systems of Japanese people and Americans are almost conflicting like an individualistic society versus a collectivist society, a society that values public welfare and safety over everything, a hyper-capitalistic hellscape. Obviously Japan also has like the influence of capitalism and is very capitalistic in its own way. I'm just saying I don't feel like even with games, just because yes, a lot of the initial stuff was inspired by America, I don't think it's fair to say that that's the reason they're liked, especially when we're talking about Australia, which has a completely separate history. Obviously it has a colonization, other stuff. We're still more similar to Australia than Japan, but I don't feel as comfortable like making assumptions to why Australia likes Japan. Canada, I do think is more culturally similar, but yeah, those are just my quick thoughts on that. Oh, and I also do think people like politeness. Like Japanese people do, like the amount of times Americans say the frame. Oh, Japanese people are so polite. You never hear that from Americans. So I feel like it may have to do with the saying earlier. Like it's about, even though our ideals are very different, I feel like This is an interesting thing. It says like people value more ideals, but I think it's just because they're democratic. Maybe the idea of democracy is so strong that it can kind of overcome a lot of the other biases or other things that a country might have that can be seen as negative. But yeah, thank you for the comments. They're awesome as always. That bell means we reached the end of today's episode. Thanks for joining us in another lazy conversation towards fluency. If you have any language-related questions and we're just looking for general advice, send an email to lazyfluency@gmail.com and we might respond in the next episode. Also, make sure to check out our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and more. We'd appreciate the support. This has been Joey.
And Yami.
Signing off. じゃねー.
Ja ne.
Next week, we'll be in Japan. Probably, maybe, we'll see.